Welcome to The Explainer, where we turn complex topics into clear, concise presentations.
All right, let's just dive right in, shall we? You know the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're pretty much the bedrock of the Christian faith. But their origins, well, that's one of history's most fascinating puzzles. And here's the thing, the names we attach to them today, they weren't always there. So how did these stories actually come to be? 40. Think about that number. That's about how many years passed between the death of Jesus, around 30 CE, and the writing of the very first gospel. 40 years. I mean, that's a huge gap in time. So for decades, before anyone wrote down the gospels we have today, the stories about Jesus, his life, his teachings, his miracles, were all passed on by word of mouth. It was a living, breathing, oral tradition. And that's really the starting point for this whole story. So you gotta wonder, what did that actually look like? I mean, how did these stories manage to travel across the entire ancient world for almost half a century just by being told? Well, imagine it kind of like a massive game of telephone, but one that stretched across the entire Roman Empire. After Jesus died, his disciples would tell these stories to win new converts. And then those new converts would tell the stories to their communities, and on it went. So you see, Christianity didn't start with a book. It spread through this incredibly powerful chain of person-to-person storytelling. And that's a key point that scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman really stress. The people who wrote the Gospels weren't just making things up out of thin air. Not at all. They were more like compilers or editors, drawing from this incredibly rich pool of stories that had already been going around for decades. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Scholars started noticing patterns in these oral stories. And to study them, they came up with this method called form criticism. It's basically a fancy term for looking at the form or the structure of a story to figure out how it was told and used back in the early church. Let me give you a great example. Think about the stories of Jesus healing people. A lot of them followed this really predictable four-step formula. First, someone's sick. Second, Jesus is asked to help. Third, Jesus does the healing, maybe with a word or a touch. And fourth, the crowd is just amazed. This kind of template, well, it made the story super easy to remember and retell, no matter if the person was blind or had leprosy. Okay, but it's not like nothing was being written down before the Gospels. Christians were definitely writing, and those early texts, they give us some really fascinating clues. So let's take a quick look at the timeline, just to get our bearings. Jesus dies around 30 CE. But check this out. The first Christian documents we actually have aren't the Gospels. They're the letters from the Apostle Paul, written way back in the 50s. That's a full 2 decades before the Gospel of Mark, the first one, shows up around 70 CE. But what's so striking is how different Paul's letters are from the Gospels. I mean, Paul goes deep into the theological meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection, but he tells us almost nothing about Jesus' life. Seriously, no miracles, no parables, hardly any of his teachings. What does that tell us? It suggests that the whole idea of a narrative biography of Jesus, that came much, much later. And there's another puzzle. Scholars notice that Matthew and Luke share a ton of material. We're talking hundreds of verses, mostly sayings of Jesus, that you just don't find in Mark. So that led to a major theory, the existence of a lost document. They call it the Q source. Q comes from the German word for source, Quelle. The idea is that Q was probably a collection of Jesus' quotes, and both Matthew and Luke had a copy they worked from. So all of this, the oral traditions, the Q source, it all leads us to the biggest mystery of them all. Who were the actual authors that sat down and wove all of this together into the Gospels we know today? Okay, now this is probably the most surprising part for a lot of people. The Gospels. They were originally anonymous. For about a century, these texts were passed around without any author's name on them. The titles we're so familiar with, the Gospel according to Matthew, those were added way later. And this is where we see this huge disconnect. On one hand, you have the traditional authors, guys like Matthew the tax collector and John the fisherman. These were Aramaic-speaking locals from Galilee. But then you look at the evidence from the texts themselves, and they're written in this highly sophisticated literary Greek. That points to very educated, very skilled authors. And here's the thing, that's a really big problem for the traditional view. In first-century Galilee, being able to read and write was incredibly rare. We're talking maybe less than 10% of the population was literate at all. To write a complex book in high-level Greek, that would have required years of elite, very expensive education, something that would have been completely out of reach for a fisherman or a local tax collector.
So, if the real authors were anonymous, educated, Greek-speaking Christians, then where in the world did the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John come from?
Well, it seems the tradition of naming the Gospels started pretty late, around the end of the 2nd century. There was this church father, a guy named Irenaeus, and around 185 CE, he's the first person we know of who specifically attributes the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you can see why, right? The goal was to give these incredibly important texts apostolic authority, to connect them to people who were right there with Jesus or his main followers. And these names weren't just picked out of a hat. There was a logic to it. Take the Gospel of John, for example. The author calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. So the early church leaders thought, okay, that has to be one of the inner circle, Peter, James, or John. Well, it can't be Peter because he shows up as a separate character all the time, and it can't be James because he was martyred way too early to have written it. So by process of elimination, it must be John. They did a similar thing for the others. Mark was linked to the Apostle Peter. He was supposedly Peter's companion and interpreter, and Luke was linked to the Apostle Paul. You see the pattern? Each gospel was given a connection, either directly or indirectly, to one of the biggest names in the early church, lending it that all-important authority. All right, so we've gone on this whole journey, from spoken stories to anonymous written texts, and finally to the books we know with their famous names. So what's the big takeaway from all this? I think the most important thing to remember is that these foundational texts didn't just drop out of the sky fully formed. Not at all. They're the end product of a long, kind of messy, and really human process. A process of storytelling, of memory, and of transmission that spanned decades and involved countless people. Storytellers, communities, and finally, a few very skilled but unknown authors. And, learning all this history doesn't take away from the Gospels. If anything, it makes them even more fascinating. It turns them into this incredible window. Through them, we don't just see a story about Jesus. We get to see the story of how the memory of Jesus was kept alive, how it was shaped, and how it was passed on by the earliest Christian communities. And so that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Knowing the very human story behind these foundational texts, does that change how we read them today? It's a powerful new lens, for sure. It reminds us that behind these words that have shaped the world, there's an incredible story of memory, community, and belief.